On the morning of my own wedding, while I stood at the doors of the church in my white gown with my hands trembling around a bouquet of pale roses, my mother did not walk up to hug me or to tell me how beautiful I looked. Instead, she grabbed the delicate fabric of my dress in both fists and tore it straight down the middle, screaming at the top of her lungs that I needed to hand over every cent of my savings to my brother before I was allowed to marry anyone. She honestly believed that in front of 200 guests, humiliated and shaking, I would break and give in. But what I did to my family in the minutes that followed left the entire church frozen in stunned silence. The truth behind my story is brutal, but before I begin, please drop your location and your local time in the comments below. I truly want to see where in the world my voice is reaching tonight, and from how many different places you are all joining me in this fight for what is right. My name is Hannah. I'm a 29-year-old charge nurse living and working in the cold, rainy, beautiful city of Seattle. For as long as I can remember, I believed that blood was thicker than water, and that family was something you protected at any cost, even if it meant grinding away your own happiness, your own savings, and your own peace of mind. I grew up in a house where my value was measured by one single question: what can Hannah give us today? If I achieved something, it was never a reason to celebrate. It was simply another resource for the family to spend. Working as a nurse in a major hospital is exhausting in ways that most people will never understand. My shifts began before sunrise and often stretched past midnight, while other people my age spent their weekends hiking the mountains around the city, falling in love, or saving for their own homes. I spent my days off picking up extra shifts and my evenings adding up bills at the kitchen table. I was the dependable daughter. I was the responsible sister. I was the one everybody called the moment a crisis hit because they all knew that I would fix it no matter what it cost me. When you spend your whole life being the emotional and financial anchor for an entire family, you slowly learn to ignore your own exhaustion. You start to think that the aching feet, the skipped meals, and the hollow loneliness are simply the price of being a good person. I told myself that if I just worked a few more shifts, if I just gave a little more, then one day my parents would finally look at me with the love and the respect that I was starving for. But that kind of hope is a fragile thing, and mine was about to be shattered in front of everyone I knew. For 7 long years, I was the only thing standing between my family and complete collapse. I was not simply helping out with a few groceries here and there. I was carrying the full weight of their entire existence on my back. Every single month, the rent on my parents' house in the suburbs came directly out of my bank account. I paid for the water, the heat, the internet, and the food that filled their refrigerator. But the heaviest weight I carried was never the house. It was my younger brother, Tyler. Tyler is 26 years old, and he is the undisputed golden child of our family. He is a textbook charmer, a smooth-talking, completely irresponsible man who has never held a job for more than a single month. From the time he was a teenager, Tyler had a sickness that my parents refused to name out loud. He was a gambler. He bet on sports, he bet at the card tables, and he bet on every foolish scheme a friend whispered into his ear. Every time he lost, and he always lost, my mother Linda and my father Greg would rush to cover the damage. They spent years telling him that he was simply unlucky, that his big win was always right around the corner, that a young man so clever and so special could not possibly be expected to live an ordinary life. If a casino took the last of his money, Linda would say the game was rigged against him. If he could not pay back a friend, Greg would quietly hand over cash and tell him not to worry. They protected him from every single consequence of his choices, and in doing so, they built a grown man who truly believed that someone would always appear to clean up his mess, and that someone, of course, was always me. I remember one winter, 2 years before my wedding, when Tyler called me at 4 a.m, sobbing into the phone, saying he had lost everything at a card table and that some men were waiting outside his apartment. I drove across the city in the freezing rain, half asleep, and handed over the contents of my emergency fund just to make the problem disappear. My mother called me the next day, not to thank me, but to remind me that a good sister does these things quietly and without complaint. That was the moment I should have understood what I was to them. But I was not ready to see it yet. I still believed that love was something you could earn if you only paid enough. So, while Tyler slept until noon, drove around the city in a car I was paying for, and threw away money he had never earned, I was running myself into the ground at the hospital. I worked double shifts. I worked holidays. I held the hands of dying strangers at 3 in the morning, and then I drove home in the dark to a tiny apartment, sat at my table, and figured out how to stretch my paycheck across 4 adults who gave me nothing in return. My social life slowly disappeared. When friends invited me to dinner, I usually said no because the money in my account was already promised to Tyler debts, to my parents' bills, and to the endless emergencies that seemed to find my family every single week. There were nights I will never forget. I remember holding the hand of an elderly woman in the final hour of her life, a woman whose own children had not come to say goodbye, and I remember thinking, with a strange and aching clarity, that I was pouring all of my tenderness into strangers while my own family drained me of everything I had. I remember falling asleep in my car in the hospital parking lot because I was too tired to drive home, only to wake up to a text from my mother asking when the next payment was coming. I remember a coworker named Diane, the only person who ever seemed to truly see me, gently asking me one afternoon why a woman who worked as hard as I did still wore the same worn shoes year after year. I did not have an answer for her. The truth was too embarrassing to say out loud. The truth was that every extra dollar I earned vanished into a family that never once said thank you. While Linda, Greg, and Tyler lived in comfort off the back of my labor, I was strict and careful with my own life. I did not buy nice clothes. I did not take vacations. I drove an old dented car that rattled at every red light. I packed the same simple lunch every day. And through all of that discipline, through all of those long and lonely years, I held on to one quiet, private dream that kept me moving forward when I wanted to give up. I was saving for a wedding and for a home. Not yet for a specific man in the beginning, but for the life I wanted to build for myself one day. I wanted a small ceremony surrounded by people who actually loved me. I wanted a down payment on a little house with a garden, a place that belonged to me and no one else. Over those 7 years, through sheer willpower and a level of sacrifice that bordered on punishing, I quietly saved exactly $200,000. That money was sacred to me. It was my ticket out of the suffocating shadow of my family, and it was the foundation of everything I dreamed my future could become. My family did not know this money existed. I kept the account hidden, the statements electronic, locked behind a private email and a second layer of security that only I could open. I knew with absolute certainty that if they ever learned about my savings, they would find a way to guilt me, pressure me, or shame me into emptying it for Tyler. So I stayed silent, and I kept paying their bills, and I told myself that as long as the money kept flowing, they would leave my secret alone. What I did not understand, what I refused to understand, was that to them I was never really a daughter or a sister. I was a bank that happened to breathe. And the moment that bank tried to close its doors, they were fully prepared to break them down. Everything changed on the day I met Daniel. He was a kind, steady, gentle man who worked as a high school science teacher, and he loved me in a way that I had never experienced in my entire life. He noticed when I was tired. He cooked for me after my long shifts. He listened when I talked, and he remembered the small things I mentioned weeks later. For the first time, I felt like a person instead of a resource. When Daniel proposed to me on a quiet beach north of the city, under a gray sky with the waves rolling in, I cried so hard I could barely say yes. We decided that I would finally use part of my savings for the wedding I had always dreamed of, and that we would save the rest together for our home. In the weeks after he proposed, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. I felt safe. Daniel asked me about my family one quiet evening, and when I finally told him the truth about the years of bills and the brother who never stopped taking, he did not pity me. He simply held my hand and told me that I deserved a life that was built around my own happiness, not around someone else's convenience. He told me that the money I had saved was mine, that I had bled for it, and that no one had the right to take it from me. For the first time in my life, someone was standing on my side of the line. I did not realize then how soon I would need someone to stand there. I made the mistake of telling my mother about the engagement. I wanted her to be happy for me. I wanted just once to have a normal moment with my family. Linda smiled and congratulated me, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes that I chose to ignore. A few weeks later, the calls began. My mother asked, in her sweetest voice, exactly how much a wedding like mine was going to cost. She asked where I had found the money. She asked again and again what my savings looked like. I should have known. I should have run. But I was so desperate for her approval that I told myself she was simply curious, simply a mother taking interest in her daughter at last. Then the real reason for her sudden warmth came crashing into the open. One evening, 3 weeks before my wedding, my parents arrived at my apartment without warning. Tyler was with them, pale and sweating, unable to look me in the eye. My mother sat down at my table, folded her hands, and told me that my brother was in serious trouble. Tyler had gambled away money that was not his to lose. He owed $90,000 to men who did not send polite reminders. My father said these men had already threatened him, that they knew where the family lived, that something terrible would happen if the debt was not paid in full within the month. And then my mother looked me dead in the eyes and said the words that ended my old life forever. She said I needed to cancel my wedding, hand over my savings, and save my brother, because family comes before some silly party in a white dress. My father nodded along, telling me that a real daughter would not hesitate, that a wedding could happen any time, but a brother was forever. Tyler did not say a single word. He simply sat there, waiting for me to bleed myself dry for him one more time, the way I always had. I told them no. My voice was shaking, but it was clear. I told them that this was my money, that I had earned every cent of it through 7 years of pain they had never once thanked me for, and that I would not throw away my future to cover a debt that Tyler had created with his own hands. I told them that I loved my brother, but that I would not light my own life on fire to keep him warm for one more night. My mother stood up slowly, her face turning to stone. She said I would regret this. She said I had no idea what I was doing. And then they left, and for the first time in my life, I did not chase after them. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. My family was only just getting started. The morning of my wedding arrived gray and soft, the kind of cloudy Seattle morning I had always loved. I stood in a small room at the back of the church in my white gown, surrounded by the $200 worth of pale roses I had chosen myself, feeling more beautiful and more hopeful than I had in years. Daniel was waiting at the altar. His family had filled half the church, warm and laughing and kind. I had invited my parents and my brother, foolishly hoping that on this one day they might choose to simply be happy for me. I should have known better. The doors at the back of the room flew open and my mother walked in with my father and Tyler right behind her. There were no smiles. There was no apology. Her eyes were burning with a desperate, ugly fury. She crossed the room in 4 quick steps, and before I understood what was happening, she grabbed the front of my wedding gown in both hands and ripped it downward with a violent, crazed jerk. The delicate fabric tore loudly, and gasps rose from the doorway where the guests had begun to gather. She screamed that I was a selfish, heartless girl, that my brother was going to die because of me, that I would not take a single step toward that altar until I signed over my savings. I begged her to stop. I clutched the torn fabric to my chest, my whole body shaking. I looked toward my father, pleading with my eyes for him to step in and protect me, to be a parent for once in his life. But Greg did not move to help me. Instead, he stepped forward, planted himself between me and the doorway to block the view of the horrified guests, and looked down at me with pure contempt. He told me that I had brought this on myself. He said that I had always thought I was better than my own family, that my mother was right, that I was nothing but a stubborn and ungrateful girl who deserved exactly what was coming. My mother raised her hand and struck me hard across the face. The sound of it cracked through the small room. My cheek burned and my eyes filled with tears, and for one terrible second, the whole world went silent. She lifted her hand again, ready to strike me a second time, but she never got the chance. What my parents did not realize, in their greedy and arrogant frenzy, was that the people standing frozen in the doorway were not strangers. They were Daniel family, and the moment my mother had torn my dress, my future father-in-law, a calm and serious man named Robert, had quietly lifted his phone and begun to record every single second of it. The double doors of the church burst fully open, and Daniel rushed in, followed by his father and 3 of his cousins, all of them tall, broad-shouldered men who placed themselves instantly between me and my mother. My mother froze, her hand still raised in the air. Before she or my father could craft a single lie, Daniel pulled me gently behind him while his father held up the phone, the red recording light still glowing, and told them in a low and steady voice that the police were already on their way. My mother began to shriek that this was a private family matter, that I was unstable, that none of them understood, but the recording did not lie, and neither did the torn dress, and neither did the bright red mark blooming across my cheek. Within 10 minutes, 2 officers from the Seattle Police Department walked through the doors of the church. My father immediately raised his hands and tried to smooth everything over, telling the officers that this was nothing more than a small disagreement between a mother and her emotional daughter on a stressful day. But I would not let him twist the story. Through my tears, I told the officers the truth, and Daniel father stepped forward and handed them the phone. The officers watched the video right there at the back of the church. They watched a mother tear apart her daughter's wedding gown and strike her across the face. They watched a father step in not to stop it, but to hide it from view and to encourage it. The evidence was damning and impossible to argue against. The officers returned with handcuffs. Right there in the entrance of the church, in front of the gathered guests, my mother Linda was arrested and charged with assault. My father Greg was arrested beside her, charged for his part in blocking the scene and supporting the attack. As they were led away down the church steps, my mother twisted around and screamed my name like a curse, telling me that I had destroyed the family, that I would regret this until the day I died. I simply watched them go, my face calm and still, the torn fabric of my dress fluttering in the cold Seattle wind. Tyler did not get arrested that day. He simply backed away from the chaos, slipped out a side door, and vanished, the same way he always vanished when the consequences finally arrived, but his time was coming too. The wedding did not happen that afternoon. How could it? But Daniel held me in the quiet church while his family cleaned up the mess, and he told me that the day was not ruined, only delayed, and that he would marry me 100 times over in 100 torn dresses if that was what it took. That night, sitting in our small apartment with my swollen cheek and my ruined gown folded in a box, I made a decision that had been 7 years in the making. The blind, unconditional loyalty I had carried my whole life was officially dead. Being the selfless, accommodating daughter had nearly cost me my dignity and my future, and I swore to myself that my life would never again belong to them. My parents had gambled everything on one belief. They believed that my brother debt and my wedding day panic would leave me weak enough to be emptied out completely. What their arrogance kept them from understanding was something they had never bothered to learn about me. I was not just a tired nurse who paid their bills. I was a careful and disciplined woman who had quietly protected herself for years. The very next morning, while my parents sat in a cold holding cell waiting to be charged, I opened my laptop, made a cup of coffee, and began the calm and deliberate work of taking back my life. For 7 long years, I had willingly kept a long list of automatic payments flowing out of my account and into theirs. With a steady hand and a clear mind, I shut down every single one of them. I canceled the automatic rent payment on my parents' house. I shut off the automatic transfers that covered their water, their heat, and their internet. I closed the shared credit card that Tyler had used to fund his lifestyle for years. I removed all 4 of them from the phone plan I had been paying for. With each click, a weight that I had carried for 7 years lifted off my shoulders. My $200,000 sat exactly where it had always been, completely untouched. They had imagined that my wedding would drain me, that my brother crisis would empty me, that I would be left with nothing. But the wedding had been paused before a single major bill was paid, and my savings had never once been at risk because I had never given them access to it. Not 1 cent of my money had gone toward Tyler debt. Not 1 cent ever would. Then I sent a quiet email to my parents' landlord, a man I had been paying faithfully every month for 7 years, explaining that I would no longer be covering the rent on the property and that all future payments were the responsibility of the tenants who lived there. If my family wanted a roof over their heads, they would have to pay for it themselves, with money they did not have and had never learned how to earn. I want to be clear about something because I have thought about it many times since. I did not act out of cruelty. I acted out of survival. For 7 years, I had given my family the chance to treat me with even a fraction of the care I gave them. And for 7 years, they had chosen again and again to see me as nothing more than a source of money. The day my mother tore my dress and struck me in front of the people I loved, she made a choice. And on the morning that followed, I made mine. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply stopped pouring myself into a bucket that had a hole in the bottom, a bucket that had never once held anything for me. The collapse came quickly. Without my paycheck covering the rent, my parents fell behind within a single month. The landlord, who had no patience left after watching the family treat a paying daughter so cruelly, began the eviction process immediately. My brother Tyler discovered the hard way that the real world does not care about a mother praise or a father excuses. With the shared credit card canceled, his phone shut off, and the family home slipping away beneath him, he was suddenly and completely alone. The men he owed $90,000 to did not disappear simply because his sister refused to pay. Tyler, who had been too clever and too special to ever hold a job, was forced to run, to hide, and finally to take the only work he could find, scrubbing dishes in the back of a loud and greasy restaurant for an hourly wage, just to keep himself off the street. I learned later that Tyler had tried to reach me dozens of times in those 6 months. He left messages, first angry, then desperate, then pleading. He told me that he had lost everything, that he was sleeping in a cramped room he shared with 2 strangers, that his hands were raw from washing dishes for 10 hours a day. He told me that he was sorry, though I was never sure if he was sorry for what he had done or simply sorry that the money had finally stopped. I did not answer a single message. For the first time in my life, his crisis was not my responsibility. The man who had been too special to work was learning, slowly and painfully, exactly how the world treats people who give nothing and take everything. 6 months later, the final day of reckoning arrived inside a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom in the heart of Seattle. I stood near the front, calm and whole, my cheek long-healed, a simple gold wedding band shining on my finger. 2 months earlier, Daniel and I had finally married in a small garden ceremony, surrounded only by people who truly loved us, and it had been the most beautiful day of my entire life. Now I watched as my mother and father were brought into the room, no longer the proud and controlling people who had treated me like property. They sat slumped and gray at the defense table, and when the prosecutor played the video for the court, the room went silent with disgust. The judge watched a mother tear apart her daughter's wedding dress and strike her across the face. He watched a father shield the attack instead of stopping it. When the video ended, the judge looked down at my parents with open contempt and said that their actions were a betrayal of everything a parent is meant to be. My mother, Linda, was sentenced to 2 years in a state correctional facility for assault. My father, Greg, was sentenced to 1 year for his role in supporting and concealing the attack, along with a fine that wiped out the last of their savings. As they were led from the courtroom in chains, my mother turned one last time and looked at me, but I had nothing left to give her, not even my tears. I walked out of that courthouse into the cool Seattle afternoon, and for the first time in 29 years, a deep and beautiful quiet settled over my chest. I did not cry for them. I did not look back. Daniel was waiting for me on the steps, and he took my hand, and together we drove home to the small house with the garden that we had bought together, the down payment paid with the savings I had fought so hard to protect. For a long time after that day, I waited to feel guilty. I had been taught my whole life that turning my back on family was the worst sin a person could commit, and I half expected the guilt to arrive like a storm, but it never came. What came instead was peace. I planted tomatoes in the garden behind our little house. I slept through entire nights without my phone buzzing with someone else's emergency. I bought myself a new pair of shoes, and I cried in the store because such a small thing had felt impossible for so many years. Daniel found me at the kitchen table one morning, simply sitting in the sunlight with my coffee, and he asked me what I was thinking about. I told him the truth. I told him that for the first time in my life, I was not thinking about anyone else at all. Looking back on everything I survived, I have come to understand a painful truth. Some people will only love you for as long as you can be useful to them. It took the most important day of my life being torn to pieces in front of 200 people for me to finally see that toxic family is no different from poison, no matter how much blood you share. But justice has a quiet and beautiful way of balancing the scales in the end. Today, I am married to a man who treasures me. Today, I live in a home that is truly my own. And today, for the very first time, my life, my money, and my future belong completely and entirely to me. Now that you have heard my story, I have to ask you something. Do you believe I was right to let the law and the consequences finally break my family apart? What would you have done if you had been standing in that torn white dress? Let me know in the comments below. And if my story gave you any strength or any peace tonight, please subscribe and ring the bell so you can stand with us again tomorrow.